I think there were some things that were said in the last panel discussion that really kind of helps us to talk about what we're going to talk about in this panel session. First of all, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Chris Holshek. I'm the co-chair of the Peace and Security Committee of the UN Association National Capital Area. I'm also with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and et cetera, et cetera. It's in my bio. I think the bio's been handed out. To tee up this discussion, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, well, almost a month ago now, actually, I posted an article in Foreign Policy called The Islamic State's Phase 4 Failure. And what I'm basically saying in this piece is, it's the old saying, right? It's easier to campaign than it is to govern. And what the Islamic State is finding out, even though we've heard about their recent successes, what movements like that eventually find out, just as we found out, the United States found out in Iraq, is that it's very difficult to go from conflict to peace, from relief to recovery, to transition out of these crises situations into something somewhat more stable. Phase 4, of course, is the Pentagon's term for post-conflict reconstruction and stability operations. And the point that I make in the article is that the real riddle to solve, not just in the Middle East, but particularly in the Middle East, is whoever figures out how to build governance and civil society more from the bottom up than the top down, which is one of the demand signals that the last panel talked about, this importance of building it from a bottom-up process. Whoever figures that out is not only going to answer the riddle, but basically get the upper hand. And here's the problem. That may not be legitimate entities. That may not be the legitimate governments in those areas. That may not be legitimate actors in those areas. That may not be the United Nations. It may be the darker side. Who gets there firstest with the mostest, as a Civil War general once said. So the point is we have another opportunity with the struggles that ISIS is having right now in actually building governance and civil society in their own image, obviously, but nonetheless, filling those gaps of when the structures that once existed with respect to those things have essentially collapsed. And what this particular panel is going to talk about is how we do that from a more strategic standpoint. How do we do that in such a way that it isn't just, well, let's just look at the security problem, or let's just look at the humanitarian problem. Because the transition management piece of this is going to require not only a ground-up, holistic approach, but it's going to require a longer-term strategic approach. This is not going to happen overnight. This is a generational process. What we're witnessing right now, we have to view it that way. And some of the things in the last panel that were really very helpful in teeing us up for that were, for example, one of them, this idea that we have to find multi-year funding mechanisms. That's not going to come from national governments like the United States, certainly, because we have this thing called Congress. So, here to tell us a bit about what that approach is, and most of us in this line of business call that peace building, is John Filson, my good friend from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, talked to us about peace building approaches. And then Dr. Stefania Piffanelli from the UN Information Office is going to try to talk to us about how the UN is trying to kind of, as one would say in the GPS, recalculate because the difficulty with the UN in that particular part of the world is, as it was mentioned in the last panel, is they are not necessarily a preferred actor. They are not as welcome in many parts of that region of the world as, for example, in Africa. And many of the mechanisms they have, like the Peacebuilding Commission and so on, may not be and have not been as effective. So their options are narrow. So how is the UN rethinking this issue? What have they found that has worked? What are they finding that isn't working? What are they finding that they may do? And you know the UN is going through an awful lot right now this year because of the high-level panel, for example, looking at re-looking at peacekeeping. And again, more holistic or strategic approaches to these problems of transition management rather than just looking at something in isolation. So, if I may, John, ask you to start first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here on this very important topic. I always feel a little bit humbled for two reasons. One, I think the reason there are continuing crises in the Middle East is because there aren't easy answers. And I'm representing peace-building voices, and we have a lot of good ideas and a lot of life experience that informs knowledge that we think is credible and useful. But we don't have all the answers for this. It's a terribly complex, difficult, sticky, long-term problem. I also feel humbled because I personally, in my life, I haven't felt a giant trauma turn my life upside down. Like having what is most dear to you in your life, if you can imagine what's most dear to you in your life, probably a person, cut down in front of you or ripped from your life suddenly. You imagine what that would do to your entire outlook in every way. So it's a little tough for someone like me to talk about this. However, appreciate the opportunity. I'll do my best. I would like to draw attention to some long-term strategies. And I would categorize those, like as Chris said, peace-building approaches to some of the long-term structural causes that underlie some of the crises that we continue to see. And I'll discuss two areas. One is international development, and another is international security. So in international development, there are the Sustainable Development Goals that is mentioned in the program and that will be finalized at the UNGA in September, is a remarkable opportunity to get ahead of some of these factors. So whereas the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, there are 8 of them, really targeted the worst symptoms of chronic poverty and the cycle of poverty and conflict. What the Sustainable Development Goals are attempting to do, and there's 17 of them, the PR professional's worst nightmare, is really not only address the symptoms of chronic poverty and underdevelopment, but its structural causes. And that has to do with social inequalities, disequitable economic opportunities, marginalization, culturally, politically, socially. And there's a couple of elements in the agenda that really stand out as opportunities for norms building over the long term. A lot of people point to Goal 16 as an important one that's focused on peaceful societies, building peaceful societies and accountable, effective institutions, political, justice, legal, governance institutions at all levels that can really help with some of these long-term structural drivers of conflict and underdevelopment. But you'll also see, if you look at the goals, I won't list them for you, but you can find them on the Google, is issues of inequality, exclusion and marginalization woven throughout all of the goals. You will see the words shared and equitable repeated throughout the goals, and that not only remarkable, but hugely important. Imagine, well, let's back up for a moment. The Millennium Development Goals were successful in the sense that they united the world around a shared idea of where we're going, where we want to go. You've all seen the 8 multicolored little icon graphics that really communicates very quickly and easily what the world wants to accomplish in terms of child mortality and education and hunger, etc. Again, they're going to have to do a good job of communicating the new goals, 17 of them, in an effective way. But what it does is give us the opportunity to unite international aid systems, when civil society is advocating to their governments, when the UN is undergoing review processes or resolutions that could shape the nature of international and multilateral assistance. The Sustainable Development Goals can be a basis on which a lot of these standards can be based. So it's hard to communicate the importance of this because it's a little bit boring. I mean, sustainable development, what does that mean? You know, you look at it and it's a lot of jargon. But what it means is that there's an opportunity for the world, all the way down to tiny community-based organizations, to get onto the same page and hold this as a standard for where the world wants to go. And if the Millennium Development Goals are in any indication, it will have a tremendous effect. So we'll see by 2030. The other aspect I wanted to highlight is how can we use better peace-building approaches in international security. So we're well aware of the security environment, certainly in the United States and globally, following 9/11. And I think, and this is just my own thoughts, I would say that we are at a very unique time in human history because technology has made it such that our species is more connected and our systems are more integrated, whether it's economies or communications or culture, than ever before. And it's not going to go backwards, meaning we're only going to become more integrated in the future. We are so integrated today that any single individual who is determined enough, or small group of people that are determined enough, for any reason, can create massive harm and disruption to our systems and our lives, simply because we are connected. One disgruntled employee in an air traffic control tower in Chicago can have a dispute with his boss and mess up some equipment, and hundreds of flights are canceled and missed, funerals, weddings, occasions that you can't get back. This is a fact of life now. So the traditional power structures, states, are grappling with this like everyone else, and as such, they look for the tools available to them. Ways they have traditionally consolidated power: military force, economic leverage, etc. And the Obama administration in February held a special summit called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. And this represents an evolution in the thinking of the US government about how to tackle the problem of the threat of terrorism, violent extremism. So after 9/11, it was the war on terror. And then it was counterterrorism, COIN, counterinsurgency. Now the latest iteration is countering violent extremism. Now, we're seeing that this giant institution is learning according to its experience and according to reality. You can't just go hammer them and assume they're going to do what we want. We have to address root causes. And the CVE Summit and the model that it describes is a recognition of this. And that's very important. It also recognizes the need to engage local communities at the community level in order to prevent radicalization. By itself, those things are very positive and very constructive. The problem, as we see it in the peacebuilding community, is that the CVE model is still based on the assumption that the problem is over there. That if we only get the programming right, if we only get the strategy right, if we only engage local communities in the right way, we get our funding streams right, We don't go in with our military convoys, but rather our hippie NGO people, and sit down and have 3 cups of tea. Then the assumption is that somewhere along the line, they will tell us who their extremists are, and then we can deal with them. And that'll be a more effective way of protecting us. The problem is, if it's apparent by the way I'm commenting, is that any international engagement, if it is to be successful, relies on trust and pivotal trust. And it doesn't matter what you call the initiative. Is it CVE? Is it counterinsurgency? Is it development? It doesn't matter what you call it. People know when something you're talking to them about is not really about them, or not really ultimately intended to be toward their benefit. In this case, it's for the benefit of some other country's protection. Countries have a right to protect themselves; they should. But the error is expecting that just by the approach, we can get local communities to de-radicalize themselves for our benefit if we only do the right things. Missing, well, briefly, I don't want to take too much time. I'll try to move quickly. But if you haven't read the CVE model's action agenda, it's still a draft. It's still in the works, but so far there are 9 points. Local research on the drivers of violent extremism, strengthen civil society's role in countering violent extremism, especially women and youth, improve relations between communities and security forces, promote counter-narratives, education, amplify moderate religious voices, prevent radicalization in prisons and rehabilitate and reintegrate fighters, improve political and economic opportunities, and use development assistance to counter violent extremism. Again, many elements of these, especially in compared to their earlier iterations, are very positive in terms of effectiveness. But what's missing from this strategy, number one, are global drivers of extremism, support for repressive, abusive regimes, the availability of weapons in the arms industry, and frankly, cultural dominance, perceived and real, and rhetoric that's very disrespectful and alienating, that don't make people like us. We're so used to it, we almost don't question it, but when you have experience crossing cultures, as all of you in this room I'm sure you do, you realize very quickly how ridiculous that looks to everyone else. And so it's funny then that we don't understand why these strategies don't work. What's also missing is dialogue with the people about whom and for whom and targeted toward whom we are attempting to formulate all these strategies. There's dialogue at the local level. Let's let our implementers talk with local community leaders and have a dialogue. Yeah, over there, that's fine. But how does our narrative, our national narrative, our identity, and who we see ourselves as in the world, and what we feel is appropriate responses to the challenges that we see in the world, how does that narrative relate to the narrative of others that are rapidly, like wildfire, recruiting extremist fighters into their cause? How are they related? How do we even begin to understand the differences in perspectives there? That, in my mind, is the only way we're going to get out of the cycle that we're in, which is, let's try this, it doesn't work. Let's try this, it doesn't work. Let's try this, it doesn't work. It's self-recognition and the willingness to be able to adjust some of the ideas we have about the world if we're to expect others to do the same. So, I don't want to take too much more time, but again, I just want to reiterate that it is possible to not constantly be responding to crises. It is possible to get out ahead and really plan and think together about how we can lay the groundwork so that the structure and systems that we live in and our diverse cultures interact in are more conducive and more resilient to the inevitable shock of conflict that will always be with us. And I would really encourage people in your conversations, whether it's crises about the Middle East or international development or security strategies, to really keep in mind that it is possible to do things in a different way. Just because we've done things one way and people who we consider smart don't generally question it, doesn't mean that it always has to be that way. That's probably enough for now, but I'll be glad to talk a little bit more with you in the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Stefania.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to congratulate the organizers for choosing a title that I believe is really the essence of what the forum is, beyond crisis management. And of course, we nested it in the Middle East, which is now one of the most troubled regions in the world. Why aren't we unable to move beyond the crisis management? Let me try to tell you why we see that from the UN's point of view. Let me start by telling you a little bit of what our setup looks like when it comes to peace and security, what the weaknesses of this setup look like, and what lies ahead. As Chris says, we have tried many things, and also John alluded to that. Some have worked, some have not worked. So certainly time to look ahead and see how we can refine our tools. All of you, I mean, certainly you are here today because you follow international affairs and you are familiar with the work of the United Nations, so I may not say anything that is new to you, but let's just go through what we have very clearly. In terms of structures, organs of the United Nations, the Security Council is the only body we have which has the ability to authorize the use of force. And that it is the only body that can authorize use of force against the will of the country that will be the object of the action. All other parts of the UN have a much harder time to influence and to see what their directives are, to see them implemented. And here I'm talking about the General Assembly. I'm also talking about a relatively newer body which reports directly to the Security Council and the General Assembly, which is the Peacebuilding Commission, and I will tell you a little bit more about that later. Then we have peacekeeping. And peacekeeping, from the point of view of the UN, is a very successful tool, and you may argue, are you sure it is? Well, peacekeeping, and the word says it, it was meant to keep the peace, meaning that you had to start with having peace. You needed to have a peace agreement, and you had to have someone to monitor that that agreement was able to stick. And peacekeeping operations with that narrow mandate indeed did their job, and they did it quite well. Then over time, mandates have proliferated, and now everything is asked to peacekeepers. I see that someone may not necessarily agree, but I hope you would agree that the narrow word peacekeeping has been kind of expanded in multidimensional operations. And with these more expanded mandates, I must admit we are still struggling. They are relatively new mandates, and in some instances we are doing well, in others we are doing less well. But I would argue that where in the theaters where we are asked to operate, which are places of active conflict, not only the UN is struggling, but many others, much more powerful than us, are struggling. Then we have preventive diplomacy, and that is conducted through the good offices of the Secretary General, and we have work on disarmament, which in some instances has been particularly successful, and here I would like to refer, for example, to the work done in Syria to remove the chemical weapons. It is estimated that not 100% of the chemical weapons in Syria have been taken out, but certainly well above 95%. That's the rough estimate, and this is an unofficial. So I'm just saying what I read. This is not UN information. We have a counter-terrorism strategy in place, which is becoming, more and more centerpiece of our action. Let me go back 1 second to the concept of the Peacebuilding Commission. Why was the Peacebuilding Commission put together? Secretary General Kofi Annan, like many of you for sure, many of their colleagues, noted a gap in the system, whereby a lot of energy and resources were deployed and were used for peacekeeping operations. But then, the moment a peacekeeping operation ceases to exist, you are left with the standard country team, which is what is our setup in regular developing countries. Unfortunately, it is not the case that after a peacekeeping mission goes, a country is ready to go for normal development. You need something in between to transition. Also in terms of resources, billions of dollars are devoted to peacekeeping, but only few hundred to development. So this gap in resources has, in many instances, meant that countries have relapsed into conflict soon after peacekeeping operations left. As the most recent tools, and John also alluded to the US strategy in this regard, is the Secretary General's strategy on countering violent extremism. He will present his strategy to the General Assembly in September, and he will co-chair, I believe, a summit with President Obama on this. And here I'm trying to quote what the Secretary General says, which gives you a sense of what the heart of his strategy is. He says, and it's probably not verbatim, but something like, you can bomb extremists, but only with good governance you can actually defeat them. So you understand that the strategy will hinge more on soft power than on military operations. And then I agree very much with what John said, that all crises come from very far back. And there are so many causes of a conflict, and we tend to cater to its eruption. And what the Sustainable Development Goals try to do is precisely to cater to the complexity of development, peace and security, keeping in mind that there is a very, very close relationship with them. And Goal 16, as John has mentioned, has to do with good governance, with rule of law, with, I have to say, issues that have been very difficult to digest for many governments. And we really hope that this goal will be part of that package that will be adopted in September. Now, in terms of, here I gave you a sense of what's the toolbox like. What is the if you ask me, what is the structural weakness of the toolbox? One, it has to do with funding. Just to give, I give you a few figures. Some of them I don't have with me. We should have asked Shelley. But every year the UN receives around $9 billion to pay for its peacekeeping missions. It receives many $billion to take care of the many acute humanitarian crises around the world. And it receives shy of 2.5 billion to take care of all the rest. So you understand that, and probably that's the way we are formatted. We tend to run after crisis, and it's really difficult to justify funding non-crisis or potential future crisis. But this is certainly structurally problematic, because as the Secretary General says all the time, we are always called to extinguish the fire. But whenever we want to go ahead and try something ahead of time, our resources are always very limited. Of course, he sends envoys, he has good offices, and we do thorough monitoring of the whole globe. But when it comes really to the strength of our response, it is not in the prevention phase. We are unable to get the required means for that stage. The other, again, not surprising, it's political. As I said before, the only organ of the UN which has the ability to authorize use of force is often blocked by crossed political leaders. That is problematic, and I do not think that will change very, very soon, frankly, because none of the members, the permanent members of the Security Council, have any incentive to give up some of their privileges. And the other structural problem with the UN, and I think, Chris, you mentioned that before, it is an organization of member states. It's an organization of governments. But now if we look around, governments are less and less relevant in a way compared to other forces that are emerging in the landscape. And the UN is working very hard to absorbing in its working methods, other actors and civil society. But I would say that probably we are not doing it as fast as other actors are emerging around us. So when it comes to the Middle East, and I took copious notes of what Shelley, Michel, and others said. Shelley talked about you need a multilateral, a multidimensional response, you need development. Michel noted the pressure that refugees are putting on receiving countries. Another looked at the source of conflict. And let me add that what I have seen is also that we have lost a little bit of sensitivity for what is happening in Syria. We are no longer, the sense of indignation is, I'm afraid, no longer there, in spite of what is happening on a daily basis. So the problem is clearly, refugees are the symptom. You don't solve the political crisis, you don't solve the refugee crisis. And I would argue that actually, Shelley knows better, Michel even better. But the world in general has been generous with the humanitarian response so far. But it seems to me that there is no patience left. There is no longer, that acute sense of needing to do something. This country, the US, is now contributing almost 50% of the humanitarian global response. It's an enormous amount of money. And my colleagues in OCHA would tell you, whenever the head of OCHA goes and asks for additional money, she knows that this is not a sustainable strategy. You cannot go ahead and ask for billions of dollars, yet you need those billions of dollars because you cannot leave refugees out there. But that is not the end of the road. And we are getting to a point where probably things are going to break loose. Now, and in terms of the political solution, as you know, we have the Secretary General has a special envoy, Stefania, who is our third special envoy. And I would argue that the UN has deployed its best diplomats for this crisis, and none of them so far has been able to sort out a solution. And for what I hear, it is essentially because all parties still have the impression that they can win this war militarily. And unless they feel that it's not the case, we can keep telling them the solution is political, is not a military solution, but they don't listen to us if they feel that they can win militarily. And I was reading today that ISIS now has conquered more than 50% of Syria. So now the balance has even changed. Again, It's me talking, not the UN. But I feel sorry for Mr. de Mistura, who is now at best able to put together and have the government and this, super diverse group which is called opposition to talk. But then you have a third agent which is not in the room, and now it occupies 50% of Syria. So I'm very sorry that I don't have much good to say, but I would like you to keep following the work of the UN and keep supporting us, because this year and next year are very key for us. This year there are a number of processes that are coming to an end. As mentioned, there is a high-level panel on peacekeeping, and it's not only going to look at peacekeeping, it is going to look at peace operations. It includes peacekeeping, meaning operations with troops, with soldiers, but also operations where we have only civilians, and we have several of those as well. There is a review of peacebuilding. As mentioned before, that gap was noticed. You needed a commission that catered for that transitional phase in between peacekeeping and normal development. But if you don't give that commission not only funds, but even some power, that what it says will follow through, then is it what you really needed? Then you have the Sustainable Development Goals in September, which, although they carry the word development, we just mentioned that everything is very much interrelated. We have climate change, end of the year, and then we have next year a humanitarian summit to look at how we do humanitarian work. So again, very, very critical year and a half. I expect it will change, not dramatically, because the UN, like all big bureaucracies, have their own conditions. But I suspect it will change the way we look at business and the way we try to do business. Thank you very much.
Okay, so at least what I'm hearing so far is that, and I think this is picking up from the last panel, is there are many different ways to go about this. Obviously, there's the multilateral mechanisms, there's the bilateral mechanisms mentioned with private sector, non-government areas, which is where largely most of these, if I can say, capabilities exist that really are going to have effect. But at the same time, you have to have all of these, and they have to be somehow or another, at least have some common references and frameworks, and even just terminologies, so that people, when they talk about these things cross-sectorally, can relate to each other, because they have to work together in some fashion or other. They're not going to be coordinated, we know that. But they at least have to figure out how to talk to each other, and it's really reaching for those frameworks. I think that's going to be the real challenge. So we really look forward to what's coming out of this year's deliberations up in New York and in other places. So with that, I'd like to take a couple of questions at a time, let the panel respond, and we'll go as far as we can. Joel.
Yes, Chris, thank you so much. And enjoyed our collaboration together. It's sad that the crises that are growing so rapidly are pulling you into looking at technology as your first answer. As Chris and I know, we have not ever talked about the human dimension and the social and cultural dimension. So you have to have a capacity before you grab all this technology. And you really understand the cultures. If you don't use no technology at it, you're going to actually help the crises just grow even more. You're actually going to feel the fire. So I think Chris has some strategies, and we do, about how you start building the capacity of the human dimension, where you're the private sector and the other groups work together.
So you have a question?
Do you see that? What is the UN doing trying to build that capacity?
Okay, that's a question. Good. Sir.
Yes, my name is Sergio Lacayama, I'm an independent consultant. I have a question for John. You mentioned previously that we're mostly in the reactive mode. We need some innovative ideas for how to get ahead of the game. Can you share some of those innovative ideas that you think would work?
Do you mean in crisis response in general, or do you mean in these crises in the Middle East, or?
Well, you mentioned previously that I was trying to write down exactly what you said. You said we've been in a mode where we're constantly responding, and that whatever it is that we're doing isn't working. That we need to look at this problem from a different point of view. And if you could just share an idea of what you mean by that point of view that maybe hasn't been tried just yet.
Well, should I take that one and then give you the question about? So, I mean, peacebuilding, we define peacebuilding as strategic activities at all levels that are meant to prevent violence and change the causes of violence. And we define violence as structural in addition to direct. So there's an unlimited number of ways that people are already working on long-term solutions to change the dynamic between large groups of people, so that when the idea of conflict or armed conflict or let's solve this with the use of force comes into play, there's less appetite for that. In terms of specific initiatives, I mean, I know that we have partners that work all over the region that are working in the business sector, working in civil society, and by that I don't just mean NGOs, but you know, the folks in the community that have legitimacy with people, really looking for what works on the ground, and the best kinds of programs are those that are in which local communities have the opportunity to identify their own problems and solutions, and then they have the ability to decide if and how to use outside resources in a way that makes the most sense to them. And of course, accountability for those programs are first and foremost to the community. You can see why that's a tall order for many donors. People who write the checks for something want to know how the money is used, whether it's Congress or whether it's a private foundation. So it's difficult, but that creates the best solution. Anyway.
Okay.
If I can just add to what John just said, what we see as classic peace building, and we have done it in some, with some degree of success. When peacekeepers leave, peacekeepers are not expected to stay for a long period of time. So towards the end of the peacekeeping phase, the most acute need to keep the two parties separated, we start building, a country in a way, in the society, and that entails rule of law, meaning you want to build the judiciary. You want also to make sure that if crimes, likely they have been committed, if crimes have been committed during the conflict, justice takes precedent, and those who have committed crimes are held accountable. We engaged in disarmament, the mobilization of former soldiers. We tried to bring them back to their communities. And of course, the most challenging of all, because it requires more money, and to stick, it has really to build, all the context is jobs. Because as was said before, what do you do with soldiers who have been brought back to the communities in thousands and do not have anything to do? So that is where the challenge lies, because it's not only, we have done many short-term trainings and started some sort of nascent activities. But if there isn't an environment that keeps them afloat, they are bound to fail. So that is really the most important of all peace-building activities, and it has to go much beyond the United Nations. It has to involve, of course, the UN and the other multilateral banks, and it has to involve private sector, essentially. You cannot take an economy, the UN cannot make an economy. It has to to be the private sector that brings it up. Going back to technology, again, here I'm not speaking as an expert, and I would like to be guided if I'm not answering what was hoped. We are looking at technology in different ways. If we think of countering violence, violent extremism, with all our technology, I mean, even a country like the United States, Europe, and so on, we have not understood how clever ISIS has been with technology. And we are now running after it, trying to put together, campaigns, trying to cater to religious leaders, trying to do our best, but we are running after someone who has outsmarted us big time, it seems to me. In terms of the application of technology to our work, we have come up with a number of proposals. In fact, the lead of the report on technology in peacekeeping is a well-known person in Washington, Jane Holshek. My take is that what she's suggesting is very practical. It's very true that technology can be used in a savvy way, not to, irritate, and that could have been maybe the case at the beginning with the idea of having some reconnaissance capacity. That's it. Sorry. With the use of drones, and there was maybe some unease from the side of some governments that the UN would conduct espionage for others, maybe even. So one has to be very careful with the use of technology. I have the impression that what that report led by Jen Luth is putting forward is something rather practical, because really peacekeeping, again, we are asked, and I quote a colleague of mine, we are asked to do peacekeeping, a type of peacekeeping that would require a Ferrari with a car that is old, which is an old Soviet Union type of car. That is how we operate. We operate with minimal equipment, really minimal equipment compared to modern armies. So while I take the point of the sensitivity, I think there is space to improve a little bit what we do. But if I didn't address what you had in mind, please.
And in a very interesting discussion that took place last week at the UN Foundation, that very issue was brought up about how certain technologies can prove to enhance the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping writ large, and where particularly the U.S. can be very helpful with that. Okay, I'm going to take two more questions and another round, and then we'll, yes sir, in the back.
My name is Robert Steele. I noticed with interest the previous panel talked about how nobody does whole of government. Ministries don't talk to each other. The Swedes have a concept called multinational, multi-agency, multidisciplinary, multi-domain information sharing. That's right. Now, I'm a former spy. I'm a pope for open source intelligence. I started that fight in 1988. The big problem that the United Nations and NATO have, in my view, is that all of their intelligence, which is technically decisions that you're supposed to be everything out there, all of their intelligence consists of lies from member nations. So my question to you is, have we reached a point now where we should have something which I've designed, which you can look up on the web, called the United Nations Open Source Decision Support Information Network? Do we need that now to have a common view of the battlefield that is capable of producing ethical, evidence-based decision support?
Okay, who won?
Yes, I'm Russell King, a retired federal employee. I got the impression from the last panel that the European Union's considering military force, but from what I heard in the news, they're not considering sinking a boat full of refugees in the Mediterranean, but there are smuggling groups, refugee smuggling criminal groups. And so as long as that refugee smuggling criminal group is separated from their human shields, obviously if they have refugees with them, they have a human shield. When it's totally legitimate, to use lethal force against that, plus any sort of non-lethal military measure such as a blockade, naval blockade, I think is also justifiable. And also I understand, like for the goal of a jihadist, okay, I don't think it's an individual acting. That individual is part of an organization which may or may not at the top of the organization have an Islamic goal. It could be a non-Islamic country doing an undercover operation. So, but all these, the United Nations is looking outside of itself, but those nations that support these criminal groups and jihadist groups, almost all of them are members of the United Nations, I would think. So what is the United Nations doing within its membership to police its own membership?
Okay. All right, who wants to go first?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Okay, let me in part respond while they're thinking. With respect to your question, I think the one thing that, in fact, one of the big areas in the high-level panel discussion about peacekeeping, sort of Rahimi 2, if you will, is this area of intelligence. In fact, in my experience in UN peacekeeping missions, when I first got in UN peacekeeping missions, intelligence was a naughty word. You never used it. You washed your mouth out with soap. You never used the word intelligence. In my last deployment with the UN, they became more comfortable with that and having their own intelligence structures, if you will. They have these things now embedded in UN missions called Joint Mission Analysis Centers. But inside the Joint Mission Analysis Center, which is a civil military mechanism, by the way, and police, I should add, so it's all three components. The word intelligence is much more readily used.
I supported General Premier. I
Yeah.
helped him build those. The problem is they don't have the sources.
Right.
They don't have the ability to reach out
Right.
and get over
And that is a problem that they're looking at right now with this particular panel. So we're going to be interested to see what they come up with. If I could just get to yours, I think what, in the last round of questions, this idea of some of the more practical issues about dealing with, to use the term, illicit power structures, I think Mike in his discussion is going to talk a lot about that and how you can marginalize those. And so without stealing Mike Tejic's thunder, I'll just kind of prick your ears right now, and for the next panel they're going to talk a lot about these more practical applications. So, have I given you enough time?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm afraid I don't have much to say on how to police the members of the United Nations, besides that this is not a new phenomenon. Hence, we have learned over 70 years to operate knowing that there are this type of behaviors, and they vary greatly across the membership, but they change over time. So of course we take that into consideration, but I'm afraid I don't have any brilliant idea on how to either punish or police member states who are perceived not to behave. And of course, one would also argue that it's very difficult to pinpoint who is misbehaving and according to whom. So I guess we went the easy route, which is operating, knowing that that happens, and go around it.
And it's that slippery slope. You know, one man's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And you know, who defines which is what? So you either start kicking people out, and then you say, well, why don't you kick the U.S. out? They're terrorists, or Israel, you know, or something. You open up a can of worms. I don't know if you want to.
I don't have answers for either question, but I am very interested in the future of where crowdsourcing is going in terms of not intelligence, but what you're bringing up, which sounds more like decision making or decision making support.
Well, Crisis Mappers is a success story.
I think you would probably know more than most about what specific initiatives might be underway to develop that, or what applications there might be. I have a sense that there's a lot going on with that in Silicon Valley or
Don't
elsewhere.
confuse technology with humans.
So I'll refer back to my original response, which is that I don't have an answer for either question. Thanks.
Okay. As we say in the firing range, any alibis. I'll give one person a chance. Yes, sir.
I love what we all are talking about. Is there a global strategy that ties the UN and the other countries together that folks agree to, that whether it's for rule of law or for all of these different pieces? Because you're right, one terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But rule of law, that there's a basic, consistent piece that runs through the cultural aspects of all of these things. And I just want to use the last panel as an example, because I've done civil society and crisis areas for 30 years. And in a lot of those pieces where you've got immigration on one hand, and then you've got immigration under stress, and you end up with refugees. And what's that global strategy that coming from the senior chessboard that says this is how we handle, because not everybody's under crisis, but it's got to be handled at on a senior chessboard as to how we do the responses, and that's got to come off of some kind of a strategic plan that's globally accepted by all of these countries. Now I understand that some of them are doing underhanded things and all of that. I've been in the middle of all of that. But is there a global strategy that works all those different pieces, or are we just kind of floating out there doing what everybody wants and everybody? Because I'll tell you, whenever it came to UN and support, we did 49 countries plus a bunch to get to 63 in Central Asia. The bottom line is that we only saw what the United States and a few of those coalition countries did or are doing, and there was an awful lot of other people, other countries doing exactly what they wanted to do, and they didn't tell us, and they didn't think that they had to. So on the chessboards that I was playing on, which were the senior levels, we had no clue, and it wasn't tied to and it certainly wasn't tied to the population. It was tied to somebody's idea of what a population might need, usually based off of the Western phenomena, not necessarily the host nations phenomena. So that's what I'm looking for out of this day, is where's that global strategy that we play inside of with all of the other countries that we're all kind of agreeing to go forward. It's no wonder you're not getting any money. I mean, I'm telling you. I mean, it is absolutely no wonder, because there is no plan, from my perspective. And that's work at the senior level.
Any responses?
I mean, I don't know if there is a senior plan. I mean, it's a very senior plan, I don't know. But within the UN, we have a sort of a cabinet, which is a General Assembly. And that General Assembly decides on certain concepts by accepting them or not. So rule of law is a concept that has gone through an evolution and has been part of many reports of the Secretary General, which have been adopted by the General Assembly. So it functions like a parliament. In terms of more targeted operations, it's the Security Council. And one would argue that the resolutions of the Council are pretty detailed. So they consist in a sort of a framework of a plan. Whether there is an entity that is more global than the UN, I don't know. I'm not aware of its existence, maybe it does. But that's the way the plan is adopted. Once the Council has decided on a course of action, what is left to us technocrats is to implement it. But the plan is given to us. Well, one could argue that that plan works, doesn't work, but it's a plan. The problem we have in Syria, you are very right, we don't have a plan. Because, as you know, the Security Council is unable to agree on a plan.
And just as a follow-on, it's not unlike many other areas that I've worked inside, where, at least for a generation, the refugees or immigrants don't go home. And they actually kind of like it where they are, because they are being taken care of. So on a global structure, what you're really dealing with is immigration, albeit under stress, that we're really dealing with as far as trying to collect money to be able to sort these pieces out. Because this is the stuff that you're talking about, whether it's ISIS today or some other name tomorrow or whatever, if those folks are not being handled through a strategic plan on a global structure, you will have a myriad of little groups, whether they're motorcycle groups in Texas or they're ISIS in the Middle East or wherever they are, that are going to be filling that gap. And that, I will tell you, you will run the baseline for anarchy really, really fast.
This is the tension.
Yeah. And there's no information, no offense, but there's no information influence operations that are positively occurring, that will change a person's mind whenever somebody's sitting there saying, I'm going to kill your family if you don't do this, or I'm going to give you a few $100 if you do this. You know, that kind of, there's nothing like that going on.
To me, it sounds like just the origins of rules, the rule of law attempts, which in my mind, laws are just more well-established norms that we have enforcement mechanisms for sometimes. I mean, examples, there's many norm-setting exercises, whether it's treaties or others, or trafficking in persons is a good example. I mean, many actors, non-state actors do it. Many states are good or bad at preventing it, but at least we can say trafficking in persons is bad, and no one can say, no, actually it's a good thing, and we support it morally. I mean, there are norms that do govern what we do, so that when we go outside of those, there are consequences, even if it's not in a formal structure of law and accountability.
Okay, if I could just quickly wrap up. I think your question is interesting because I think what it does is it demonstrates that maybe the issue is we're looking at the whole thing. It's that old saying, the answer you get depends on how you frame the question, right? We're framing the question in a very traditional hierarchical way of looking at it from the top down. You use the word strategy as a plan. I'm not gonna get into an argument whether a strategy is a plan or not. We can talk about that offline. The point is this: we keep looking for something that is, where's the plan? A plan implies somebody's got to have consensus, it's got to be top down, it's got to be fed to the bottom. And that's precisely why we're not getting anywhere. The good news is this. The good news is international mechanisms like the UN have already helped us to identify certain principles. Look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are many different things out there that offer us principles that begin to help us frame the approach more from the bottom up and not just the top down. Peace-building approaches, bottom up. The good news is that is probably our entry point. And we can gain some ground. There are some advantages and disadvantages of that. One of the disadvantages is you're not going to get a return on investment real quick. This is generational work. But what we can, instead of maybe looking at a plan or a strategy, the plan, as we would think of it, is the strategy maybe to work on how can we take certain norms, frames, laws of war, international norms, principles, etc., and operationalize them through certain models on the practical side that can help make those actually create governance in civil society at a community-based level.
Consensus.
In a consensus approach. So the different actors at least have those frameworks that they can refer to. That is what the next panel I think is going to start talking about on a practical level, is how do we do that, not just only to build peace, and I credit Mike Gijic for teaching me this. To me, building peace, or whatever the larger term is, peace operations, is really nothing more, counterinsurgency, all these things, really nothing more than maximizing stakeholders and minimizing spoilers. And getting the undecideds, just like in politics, to go from being a stakeholder in the process to away from being a spoiler, or at least a non-actor. And that is a long-term, non-linear process. It can't be directed from the top down. It has to be largely moved from the bottom up. After all, think about the way this country has been built. We have a model right here in this country. It's built from the bottom up and not from the top down. That's the secret to its success. So with that, real quick break. Al, come up here and take the microphone, and we'll talk about the more practical side of it.